Before.
Perfect. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Red Wheelbarrow Poetry Society. Our guest poet for the evening is Brian Walter. Brian is from Wheelbarrow, has 6 collections published. He is a member of the Echo Poet Society, if I'm correct. And in terms of how the evening will unfold, Brian will read for 45 minutes or so. Then we'll have some questions and answers or comments. Very short break, and then we'll open the mic. Yeah, that's about it. We look forward to hearing your work, Brian, and we're ready when you are.
Thanks, Lisa. And can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. I had some trouble deciding what to read tonight, trying to balance what I've possibly read before, what I would like to read in McGregor in November. And anyway, I've come up with a selection and I hope it is fitting. The first poem I want to read is called Down. And I find a lot of my work does go downwards. It's sort of, and I'll point out a few other instances, but it tends to be partly a relationship with the earth. Also, in this case, it's the Dante-esque journey down into the underworld. But this poem it's one part of a sequence of 4. And I wrote it when I was in Zimbabwe recently, and I was going around with some bird guides, Morgan Sanetti and Uluwezi Murambiwa, and they were taking us around, my brother and I, looking at birds. It was quite a novel experience for me. Down. We left the inn and its moss-grown wartime fortification, traipsing out to get the lie of the land. Beneath forest trees, he stopped, stood still, in his brown clothing, becoming part of his soil, pointing out with practiced certainty his long distilled observations, guiding us and turning my unfocused view into clear bird sight, the sudden epiphany of bird being, the knowing new and fresh. He led us along paths familiar to himself, part of his mind and memory, through undergrowth, I downing like Dante into greater darkness and fluttering truth, where the world I see has already passed. He'd stand, a still figure in the chittering parliament of birds, deeply listening to each voice, long reaching with feeler ears into the woods and later the reed beds, his fingers as if conducting the calls, hearing each season's new behavior, knowing the birds there with hardly a glance, till I felt surrounded by flickering truths I couldn't quite grasp, leading truths, ephemeral, quiet, that spoke subtly of our human ways and the earthly sins of the upper world, of miners and developers, till I felt I was listening to the chirp of a muse I couldn't know, standing in the Sibyl's darkness with scraps of truth fluttering past, and a guide trying to show me the way. There, he points. But the truth he would show has already flitted into the dark. Now, the next poem is called Screenplay, and I wrote it with my son Michael in mind. Michael's in the UAE now, and I think he's just tuned in. But it's also a nature poem, but it's kind of trying to find where we place nature these days. Nature was a big and frightening thing, and yet nowadays, people are talking. They're talking about, let's save the whales, let's save. And I don't quite know. I can't place, although I have a strong, I think, relationship with the natural world. I'm finding the way humans look at nature increasingly odd. So it's called screenplay for Michael. The kudu group comes up from drinking slowly across the open, low lakeside where the water has dropped this drought. The bull leads. His turning horns catch the twilight, glinting in curves. His chest mane sways, reflecting bright. The low angle places the beast proud against the backdrop, the semi-desert, shrub filled, and distant shining sunset grass, the eternal grey-blue hills lost in deep transparency establish his presence. Pan left to the family group, briefly hold the first view, her big ear gentleness, and track out, showing as they come slowly single file, the hues, the young, bowed and revealed in the sunset plain. Zoom out to include again the male. Track out further, slowly away, till the point of view is behind the scenes, behind a reed lattice, the full viewing slot, now placing the viewer within the hide. Then track further back to show the team benched inside with binoculars, some with cameras, murmuring, pointing. And now the kudu group, small in the background, far beyond that proscenium cut of the hide slit, plays at being normal. Batis capensis is a Cape Batis, a little flycatcher, and I'm sorry I'm starting with so many poems about this sort of thing, but it's what I do. Batis capensis, beautiful little birds, the Cape Batises, and I get them just outside. I'm sitting in my study now, and just outside the window here in Badleir Bush, to find these Cape Batises flitting, distracting me from my computer. Batis capensis, the solstice has turned, and out front the wild Badleir is quickly coming into bloom with her briefly filigree flowers that are almost too sweet smelling, and humming bees are hovering in. Backing onto my study window, this bush has claimed a third of my view, so I see few flowers or leaves, but more structure and stem, upright or aslant leaning, and then the back of the canopy. So I'm party to an inner life, a twigscape, where two sudden Cape Batis flycatchers flit, a handsome male and dashing mate. She has an earthy ochre on her Nguni cow, black and white. They flit and hunt, safe within the bush, except that I am aware that I am watching, unseen, being quiet, and watching the Cape robin come in, bulling the space with wing flick bigness, and I thinking I'm watching a new animation rouse and tussle, watching the twigs behind the public filigree of poetry, watching in green shade this turning solstice time some new stirrings of thought at the back of my mind. Now, I don't know if my mate Jabu Bum is with us. He said he would try and join. And on that basis, I put a little poem in for Jabu. Jabu and I worked together for a while and did some interesting trips up and down the Sundays River Valley and discussing this and that. And we grew to be great friends. We used to drive past a place called Ferreira's Pan. And this poem, Ferreira's Pan, is for Jabu Bum. When we were kids, our father would stop the car at the flay. We were on our way to Addo or back, so we could see which birds were there, dabchick, makoa duck, grey heron, or coot. Now Motherwell, the big township, has grown and dwells nearby, trailing her vast and brooding graveyard. And I've stopped and chatted to the guys of Aquata with their circumcision school, and the poor pan is trodden down and dry. I told Jabu of its once abundance, and when we pass, he calls it the bird watching place, reverencing for me my own memory on the fledgling breath of the treading future. I wrote some poems recently on a trip to the wilderness, and that's the title of this little sequence, Wilderness. Softly offering purple blue, the water lilies hold flowers up from the still water. Sedge grows full-bodied and rich on the flay banks. Laughing doves call, tender and tranquil. The cottage there, smoke rising from the chimney stack, fat-bellied, happy smoke, and my pastoral mind drifts with it, takes its hue into the grey and livelong sky. Next poem. It is the sort of day when mists match your mood. The old Australian gums stand tall and still. The white cliffs that streak the mountains match the sky. The sedge around the flay is green and dead still. Sounds seem to sound distant. Dove calls throb my pulse. Little haiku. Nowadays, people suggest that you don't need to use the stressed form. I like to because it forces you into new ways of thinking. So it would make a 5-syllable line out of one word, like imagination.
I'm so sorry, Brian, to interrupt you. Your bandwidth
You
is
gave me a
low.
fright.
So would you mind just putting your video for the remainder of your reading, because there's a bit of a lag, and I fear it might get worse. My screen's telling me that your bandwidth is low, and it should help.
Yeah, I don't mind at all.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. Then I can relax here. Is that a bit better?
It's automatically. Thank you.
Okay. The next poem, as I say, is a haiku, and it's to make a 5-stressed line out of one word. Imagination. That black crake softly treading, yielding lily pads. The next poem of that sequence is called Psychomachia. Psychomachia is probably medieval Latin or something. It's a battle between two characters on a play, but no, it's really a battle of the psyche, an allegory of a battle between two aspects of your mind. Psychomachia. These black crates spreading softly across the surface growth seem to have chicks secure in the sedge. There, a fledgling, tentative, towing pads held shakily afloat by surface tension. Then there, an adult comes, insect in her bill. But my thoughts drift off to Keats's lake, its sedge as withered as a dry dream. I consider death what one knows of death, and despair is a nestling in my blood. My adult self is bringing in its food, certain and resolute across the water. I must think myself away to where the old Egyptians found paradise, far off in a delta rich with rushes. And in this southern flay, I find the great Nile as if reflected across Africa, ageless images of rich life and birds on water. I try to nurse that long gone paradise in my thoughts, to get the sedge to grow lush and strong, rooting deep against old grief, to nest my peace in the cool shade of sedge stalks, my being in the shade of blue-purple blooms, instructing my heart to live while yet living, bringing the sedge, the water, and the crakes, the floating lily pads into mind, to carry in the hieroglyphic of this rush of poem bed. The next piece, and I'll stop that sequence with it, is another haiku. And I don't like to sort of describe the image too much before reading the poem, but it might help. I was looking at a lamp at this cottage we were staying at, and against this lamp, the swallows had built a mud nest, and it was autumn when we were there. So the nest was not at that moment being used, but it was, yeah, it was there waiting. So the description of that is mud and the day grey electric lamp, swallow's nest cupped, autumn empty. I mentioned Keats a bit earlier, and Keats is an incredibly rich poet and did a lot in his 25 or 6 years. But he also wrote this poem about when I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, and that before he had traced the clouds that, and he was looking forward to writing and was afraid he would not get to it. And that poem is sort of referenced here in the strange company of Armand and his novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And I like to put them together in this poem because one of the few academic papers I did present when I was in the academic world was a drawing together of John Keats and Armand, and it was quite a lot of fun. Alice days. Alice was where I was at the University of Fort Hare, many years ago now. Alice days when my fellow poet was alive. The sewers run freely in Alice today, and there's a green ooze in the streets. The gutters are full, overflowing into yards. We walk home, teachers of Keats and of Armand. This town has an Elizabethan smell, you note, universalizing the stench. And old hippies need dainty nosegays, I muse, though my bones remember the plague. The ship runs into a gully. Upstream is that pastoral spot of trees, the paradise flycatcher's nest, and the spring always organically wet. Downstream, muck debouches into the Tumi. The older local writing is more mindful of Tumi side, where the Fort Hare campus was rooted with a dogged and defiant dream, when the river ran unspoiled and rare birds could breathe, than now, when security fences cut students off from the grassy banks that led to where the nurses trained. Today, filth runs the streets into the Tumi, like a dream turned sour. We carefully step over the last foul leaks on our way up home, where at last we drink our day washing beer in the softening and reflective dusk, wondering if we'd ever live to trace the earthly forms of those caring, upright, kindly shades, the beautiful ones, unborn. I'm kind of watching the time a bit, I have a little sequence here, and I've already selected from it. And I think as I am live here, I'm going to select a bit more. It's called Writing Room, and that's the title of a manuscript that I have put together that is now seeking its way into the world. Um, Writing Room talks in this literal instance, not in its more figurative aspects. The Writing Room talks about the room that the Helen Vale poets with whom I ran a writing project that they write in. And there's that little sequence is for Byron Armut, one of our poets who really sadly a few years ago now was shot in the local violence of that place and died. So the writing room for Byron Armut, and I'm going to probably select even fewer poems from this as I go through it, but I'll start with the first one, which is called Paganini in Helenvale. The violin softly cuts the computer unit's hum. From gangster streets, the kids come to write to Paganini today in minor key. The clouds are low, and rain seems to be hanging in the air like a fresh sadness, waiting to drizzle, waiting for words to settle, dripping as the violin bows. Touch. Today we do touch, and the writers pass from hand to hand a sliver of rock I found at some forgotten place. I favor flat-sided stones for my bonsais, that they may seem to be larger rocks planted deeper down into the earth, that ancient artful thing of softly suggestive blood-filling, of mind-shaping, letting appearances lead perception, settling the stone into the soil beneath a small Thai apple tree, making a tiny East Cape paradise. I see its edge has nicks and chips, and pull it up to look again. The wedge shape slips to hand, and an ancient stone cutting tool fits comfortably across time into the definition of my palm. The warming, solid wonder of it, the texture of something sacred, this sliver of rock, shaped and crafted. God knows its situation, gathered unawares. I can't return the long past to its place and right the guilt of meddlesome hands. So now I pass it round for writers to trace in their own hands the long dead living hands that shaped this rock, to cut the hunted flesh, to feel brave new thought fixed into stone, to know. For today we do touch. For Leonie Williams, last night you read your poems from your life in a language the listeners did not know, but you held them by expression, mood, gesture, the way your voice acted, giving them rhythm, sound, tensioning tone, while quietly your heart bled. Urgent. Last week you cancelled poetry, and perhaps I'd better just say, this Helen Vale, where I do run this poetry project is, well, Leonie, I just read a poem for her. She phoned in yesterday. She couldn't come. They just did, someone had just shot in crossfire, basically, the child of her neighbor. And suddenly the police were out, and the police whom one never really sees much, and there they all were, and this kid died on the spot. So it's a horrid backstory to a lot of the lives of the children that I work with. Urgent. Last week you cancelled poetry. The shooting was too intense. Another young boy killed in crossfire from the gangs, you say. Then describe the sound of bullets death whistling down, or out of death whistling by, or out of power fatting down. For now we regroup again for words, discuss that nascent novel, wonder how to crack the poems within. But all this stuff you talk of, you should urgently write it down, write it out, describe, reflect, write around Helen Vale's small houses, throw plastered, semi-detached, an interior just above each step, where doorways each evening form brief domestic oil paintings. Outside, in the streetlight glow, children get their last games pavemented in till darkness comes and night walkers go where unwritten words can't begin. Normality. This is sort of out of that sequence, but it's in the same vein. I used the word normal at the beginning part of this poem, and then I query hell, what the heck you mean when you use a word like normal. Normality. The cowboys are now shooting, you say on the phone, of your neighbors, and you'll be late for the writing. And I, naive in this world, say, but it's quiet here in Corbus Road where kids play cricket in the street. Stones in the road are placed apart to make metaphors for soccer posts. Girls stroll around in ironic PJs. Toddlers wobble the grey pavement where rubbish is piled shoulder high. Yes, I hear myself say, things seem quite normal here. Not here. Your tight voice comes over the phone. You have to wait until they stop with the guns. You come later, join the writers, rehearse the reading, and we have our space of peace and poetry. Then driving home, I slow up for police vans and crowds and bodies on pavements, kids sit on walls. It's 5 guys arrested, hands fastened behind backs, lying face down. One guy lifts his head, checking, challenging. The other 4 lie still, cheeks on the sidewalk, rain resigned to the earth. Now, given to a beer and my normal, given to a beer and my journal at my local, I can't transcribe the cracks. I'll never divine what normal might be. Um, there's a phrase I used earlier in one of the poems when Leonie was reading. She's reading a verse, and there was German funders whom we were really hoping to impress. German funders were there, but they couldn't understand. She was reading in a language that the strangers do not know. And this poem is about that phrase. It's called The Bar. A post, that's a bar you go to have a beer. That's not the crossing of the bar or the legal bar. It's just a more ordinary bar. The bar, a post second-hand bookshop beer. That's always a nice beer if you like beer. Go to a second-hand bookshop and then take your books and you sit with them for a while. The bar, a post second-hand bookshop beer on a hot Cape Town afternoon, and I've unearthed an old hardback, a volume of South African poetry. The old guy with his whiskey prods, then says he didn't think there was any poetry in South Africa. Irish, as his brogue makes clear, but married to a Burumesi, he says, who's a short while dead. And he tears up, and in his cups he softly sings of Galway Bay, his frail eyes wet and blue as salt, his voice breaking as he chants of the language that the strangers do not know. I listen, a stranger to myself, to him, my own country, to the South African poetry bound tightly in hardcover in the English volume on the bar, while we try to break a silence that settled with the air is sung. Pantry thoughts. This is the sort that I think, perhaps I should say it's a covert poem. During that time of our long isolation, this is one of the poems that came out, conceived in the pantry where I was going to do odds and ends. Pantry thoughts. In the pantry, pondering supper, I hear the clicking of the inverter that controls our electricity, translated from sun rays. At just about this time, as the earth rolls from the sun into night, this power unit goes to sleep, and energy then is drawn from batteries where it has been stored, like these pickles in a jar, holding time. This dusk, I catch a splash and resonance, rain, and the flow of water into our big tank. God, I say to you, there is no better sound in all this world than of guttering tanks after the long drought. That water gurgle, the sound of fermenting beer, you retort, bubbling ripe gas up through the air traps those early weeks of the virus lockdown with the bottle stores closed. I remember how you watched for hours and then said, there's no better sound than beer bubbling, brewing slowly for 2 weeks hence. I recall I made all I could with what we had, a rough and ready cider, ginger beer, and a hasty, heady pineapple brew that kept an internal party going long after you'd gone to bed, driving me, getting me wondering about my mind. And all these things we stow for later, perhaps for a time after this pandemic, a time we may not be here to share that this virus fills folk so unpredictably. Shows of faith that we may reap, faltering faith, or it may yet come down to naught. Then, in the pantry's deepening dark, I muse on my dad's last bitter homebrew we downed that Christmas, long after he had gone. Memory, after all, is our first store, the vital fullness we unfold in time. I'm going to end off, because I think it's time. I'm going to end off with a little sequence I've called Antaeus. Um, it's also the closing of the manuscript of the collection I've called Writing Room, and it comes back to a writing room. When I taught in Grahamstown for a while and worked at Wordfest, sometimes gave workshops in the old nuns' chapel in the St. Peter's building or near the St. Peter's building. And this sequence is called Antaeus. And I was mentioning the earth earlier, the going down of the Dantesque journey. Antaeus was a giant of Libya, the son of Poseidon, and he was the son of Poseidon and the earth goddess, who has become more and more prominent now, our earth mother. And he used to wrestle with strangers that came by. And when the strangers threw him down to earth, well, didn't his mother give him the strength he needed to fight back? So he got his strength from the ground. And Heracles, in fighting him, Heracles had to work out that he had to lift him off the earth in order to defeat him. And I'm fascinated by this story because it's the strength that comes up from the earth, unlike the platonic strength that comes from above, from the first mover from the heavens, which was aligned with more spiritual interpretations later into the Christian Neoplatonism and somewhat. And it gave us the sense that the heavens were good, the earth was bad. The soul was good, the body was bad. The head, the seat of reason, was good. The lower body, very, very bad. And I kind of think when I ponder on these things that I've always enjoyed Shakespeare's sonnet. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. And then you have the eyes, part of the upper body, and the sun, part of the heavens. And the sonnet ends with, my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And I like that sense that the ground and Taeus, and so I'm going to read this little sequence, and then that will be it. Antaeus, my longing lies white in the sun. That old plastic spoon there, discarded, upside down, hungry for the earth. From inside the mud hut, I watch the world without the dawn. The sunlit thorn tree mazes, the dried mud yard. I hear her speak to the man in closer. A hen bobs her head, then her body comes past the doorway. Her chicks explore. Two come right over the threshold and into the dark. She clucks and moves off, and I watch how the two, so easily slipping in, struggle to get out. I notice the 2-finger high dorsal of mud and wonder why it is a raised earth strip. See that the outside of the and this floor are at one level. Deduce that where the door closes, it needs a lip to keep rainwater out. Now one chick is up and over, the other flustering, running side to side, till with wing flaps and scurry, she is up and hightailing after the hen and her brood. Later, Asanda says she is sorry she spoke for so long with the headman. I say no, I was fine, alone in the earth room. I felt I'd become a mild and Taeus, garnering old mother strength and peace, watching the sun-filtered thorn maze and the chickens, pilgrims through this place. 3. All night my nerves flashed back to the time when that inner voice of mine was wavering, uncertain, reaching for respect, faltering in the face of his quick-tongued cocksure control, his voice towering, assuming some David authority, his words chosen and slung, knocking me till kindness was stricken and feelings shred. Each word hit like a selected stone, each as dead as that stranded cuttlefish shell I once found, dried white on the sand, predatory tooth marks telling its death. All night I felt like Goliath going down. This morning the group gathers to write. The late afternoon day is calm and soft with no wind off the bay. Waking words are tender between us and stretching till like earthy, Libyan and Taeus, I feel a gritty growth of kindness, grounded. The last two poems in the sequence, and I'll end with them, are set in the nuns' chapel, St. Peter's building, and Peter's name himself has its own earthly ring with the sense of it, the rock The aura of sanctity here is in quietness of stone walls. The chapel coldness of retreat has metamorphosed into writing room. In this old place repurposed, I speak to people now, scared of how I may just fumble words. And as I speak, my mind rambles out to the quiet Karoo. Oh, our southern Sahel of stone and peace, being and long time in the back room of my mind. In talking, my own sanctuary roots my nervous words, and I unearth that holy place within my own long time being, whence cometh my help. 4. The heavy chapel door is closed against the cold. The electric heaters glow, but offer little to the ice crack air. While writers write, I muse on crossing the threefold threshold, the knocker, the doorway, and then the deep inn. In this cold place, stained glass in the morning sun sparks blues, reds, and yellows, and raises again Christ's landscapes in still life, bringing glints of outside in, reflecting in image tales from afar. Amongst the stones, cut and shaped to purpose, O Peter, Petrus, the figure of Christ the shepherd is kindly caught in the glass. Glass from the earth, stone from the quarries, built to catch the morning light, raising matter into meaning. I feel the absence of the nuns, their once upon a time reverence, as though someone has just gone and left the stained glass ajar. Thank you, everyone. Are you still there?
Yes, we are. Thank you, Brian. Maybe feel before we give you your round of applause, I just thought I'd let you know that Jabu did eventually arrive, and if you want to, it would be quite sweet for you to maybe do that poem again if it's a possibility.
Jabo, how's it, man? You're gonna get your poem twice. Eh? I'll just have to find it very quickly. I will do so. It's called Pereira's Poem. And I guess it reflects some of the history of old Port Elizabeth, and when the early parts of Port Elizabeth were settled by the earliest of the trade groups that arrived here before the English came in. And the place was settled, and now further history, Port Elizabeth is Kabaja. So it's got those layers too. Pereira's Pan, the Jabu Bum. When we were kids, our father would stop the car at the flay. We were on our way to Adder or back, so we could see which birds were there. Dabchick, makoa duck, grey heron or coot. Now Motherwell, the big township, has grown and dwells nearby, trailing her vast and brooding graveyard. And I've stopped and chatted to the guys of Aqueta with their circumcision school, and the poor pan is trodden down and dry. I told Jabu of its once abundance, and when we pass, he calls it the bird watching place, reverencing for me my own memory on the fledgling breath of our treading future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for giving me a chance to do that for Jabu.
Of course, of course. It was absolutely lovely. Are you a bird watcher, if I may ask?
I'm a second-hand bird watcher. You get them too.
What does that entail?
My older brother is a first-hand bird watcher. He is a serious guy. And ever since I was a kid, I was dragged out in his wake to look at birds, or chased away when I was following him to look at birds. And so all my life it's been that. So I know little bits and pieces from being in his space, really. And yeah, so, and I keep my eye on birds. The one poem I read about the bird guides, that comes from a little sequence called auguries of uncertainty. And auguries are, I heard you guys talking about indigenous knowledge before, but auguries was the way of telling the future from birds and bird movements and so on. So birds are poetic and prophetic and interesting.
Indeed, indeed. We usually, Jabba says he had load shedding. We usually stop the recording before we go to the answer and question part. But perhaps we could take this moment to give Ryan and his applause for the evening. Very sweet. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll have our questions and answers. And you can just raise your hand. That's usually how